We live in a world that celebrates the beginning of things. We throw parties for births, we toast to new careers, and we weep with joy at weddings. We are obsessed with the I do, but we are terrified of the I can't anymore. To many, the word divorce doesn't sound like a legal process. It sounds like a funeral for a version of yourself that you promised to protect. If you are someone who finds themselves paralyzed by the mere thought of leaving, even when the house is cold, the bed is a battlefield, or the silence between you has become deafening, it is not because you are weak. It's because you are fighting a ghost that was born long before you ever met your partner. You stay not because you are happy, but because the unknown feels like a sheer cliff, and you've convinced yourself that walking on glass is safer than jumping into the fog. You tell yourself it's for the children, or for the finances, or because it's not that bad. But beneath those logical shields, there is a deeper, more primal tremor. It is the fear of becoming a broken thing in a world that demands wholeness. It is the fear that if this fails, you have failed at the very project of being a human being. Let's look at the quiet architecture of that fear. Why does the idea of a legal document feel like a death sentence? For many, the resistance to divorce isn't about the partner at all. It's about a concept called cognitive dissonance of identity. You have spent years, perhaps decades, weaving your identity into the fabric of we. To pull that thread is to watch your entire self-image unravel. Who are you if you aren't a wife? Who are you if you aren't the husband who stuck it out? When you look in the mirror, you don't see a person seeking freedom. You see a person losing their gravity. This paralysis often traces back to the ghost of the first home. Psychology tells us that our attachment styles, the blueprints for how we love and leave, are etched into our nervous systems before we even learn to ride a bike. If you grew up in a home where love was conditional, or where a parent's departure caused a collapse of the family ecosystem, leaving isn't just a choice, it's a trauma trigger. To you, divorce isn't a transition, it's an abandonment. You have spent your entire adult life trying to be the fixer, the one who holds the walls up, because you believe that if you let go, the sky will literally fall. You are repeating a childhood survival strategy. If I am perfect enough, if I endure enough, I can prevent the loss. But there is a specific kind of agony in staying that we rarely name. It's called ambiguous loss. This is the grief of losing someone who is still sitting right across from you at the dinner table. It's the mourning of a marriage that exists in name but has died in spirit. You are afraid of divorce because it makes the death official. As long as you stay, you can pretend the patient is still breathing. You can live in the maybe. Maybe they'll change. Maybe next year will be better. Maybe if I just explain it one more time, they'll finally hear me. The fear of divorce is often just a desperate addiction to maybe, because never is too heavy to carry. We must also talk about the sunken cost fallacy of the heart. You look at the 10, 20, or 30 years you've invested. You think about the shared bank accounts, the holidays, the furniture you picked out together when you were young and full of light. To leave feels like admitting that all those years were a waste. It feels like throwing away a library because the final chapter is tragic. But this is the great illusion. We treat time like a currency we can get back if we just work harder. But time is water. Whether you stay or leave, those years are gone. The question is whether you want to spend the next 10 years paying for the mistakes of the last 10. There is a profound societal weight here, too, an emotional erosion caused by the stigma of the broken home. We have been conditioned to believe that a long, miserable marriage is a success, and a short, healthy one that ends is a failure. We value the duration of a bond over the quality of the soul inside it. You may find yourself staying because you are afraid of the whispers at the grocery store, the look in your parents' eyes, or the feeling of being the divorced friend at the dinner party. You have mistaken longevity for virtue. You are sacrificing your internal peace at the altar of external perception. And then there is the most terrifying ghost of all, the fear of the void. For some, the partner, no matter how cold or distant, serves as a buffer between them and the crushing weight of their own company. If you leave, you are forced to meet yourself. Without the noise of the conflict, without the project of fixing the marriage, you are left in a silent room with your own thoughts, your own regrets, and your own untapped potential. For many, the chaos of a bad marriage is actually a distraction. It's a loud, frantic song that drowns out the terrifying question, who am I when I am not suffering for someone else? You might feel a strange sense of guilt, as if your desire for happiness is a form of betrayal. This is often the result of enmeshment trauma, where you were taught that you were responsible for everyone else's emotions but your own. You worry that if you leave, your partner will spiral. You worry your children will never recover. You carry the weight of the entire family's emotional regulation on your shoulders. You've become a human pillar, so focused on holding up the roof that you haven't noticed your own foundation is turning to dust. We often stay because we have been gaslit, either by our partners or by our own upbringing, into believing that our standards are too high. We tell ourselves that everyone is unhappy or that marriage is just hard work. While marriage does require effort, there is a fundamental difference between the hard work of building a home and the hard work of trying to breathe underwater. If you are afraid of divorce, it might be because you've forgotten what it feels like to stand on dry land. You've adapted to the pressure of the deep sea, and the idea of oxygen feels frighteningly unfamiliar. This fear isn't just an emotion, it's a biological state. When we are in a state of chronic relationship stress, our nervous system stays in a freeze response. You aren't indecisive, you are physiologically paralyzed. Your brain's amygdala is screaming that departure equals death. To your ancient survival-focused brain, the tribe, the family unit, is life. To be cast out or to cast yourself out feels like being left in the wild to starve. This is why you can be logically certain that you should leave, yet find yourself unable to pack a single bag. Your body is trying to save you from a lion that isn't there, not realizing that the safety of the cave is what's actually killing you. But what happens when the safety of staying becomes more dangerous than the risk of leaving? What happens when the cost of the I do becomes your very soul? We need to look closer at the moment the scales tip, the moment the fear of staying finally, painfully outweighs the exit.
The tipping point rarely arrives like a lightning bolt. It comes as a slow, cold realization in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, looking at your reflection in a darkened window. You realize that the person staring back is a stranger, a ghost who has been hollowed out by the effort of pretending. This is the point of diminishing returns in a relationship. It is the moment you realize that you aren't fighting for the marriage anymore. You are simply fighting to survive the day. We often talk about the trauma of divorce, but we rarely discuss the trauma of the frozen life. Every year you spend in a state of hypervigilance, walking on eggshells, or living in a state of emotional starvation, you are rewiring your brain. You are teaching your heart that its needs do not matter. You are teaching your children that love is a transaction of endurance, not a source of joy. If the fear of divorce is a wall, then the reality of staying is a slow-acting poison. One of the most profound reasons we fear the end is the myth of the finality. We see divorce as a hard stop, a cliff edge where the story ends. But in the landscape of the human psyche, divorce is often a corrective emotional experience. It is the act of finally, perhaps for the first time in your life, choosing yourself. It is the moment you stop being a character in someone else's drama and start being the author of your own. When you move past the initial terror, you realize that the broken home was already broken. The divorce is simply the act of clearing away the rubble so you can finally see the sun. Consider the psychology of moral injury. Many people stay because they feel they are breaking a sacred vow, a promise they made to a younger version of themselves or to a higher power. You feel like a traitor to your own word. But a vow is a living thing. It requires two people to nourish it. When a relationship becomes abusive, neglectful, or entirely one-sided, the vow has already been broken, not by the person who leaves, but by the circumstances that made staying impossible. You are not breaking the marriage. You are finally acknowledging that it is already dissolved. You are simply the one brave enough to say it out loud. The pivot toward healing begins when you reframe your fear as a signal. Fear is not a stop sign, it is a compass. It is pointing toward the areas of your soul that still feel unworthy of peace. It is showing you where you still believe that you deserve to suffer. To move toward the door is not an act of cruelty toward your partner, it is an act of radical mercy toward yourself. It is the recognition that you were not put on this earth to be a martyr for a bond that no longer serves the growth of either person. We must also dismantle the fear of the others. You worry about what your children will think, but children do not learn from what we tell them, they learn from what we tolerate. By staying in a loveless or toxic union, you are giving them a map of a desert and telling them it's an ocean. By choosing the difficult path of truth, you are teaching them that their happiness is worth the struggle and that it is never too late to reclaim one's life. You are giving them the gift of a parent who is whole rather than a parent who is merely present. As you stand at this threshold, the air feels thin. The unknown is still there, and yes, it will be difficult. There will be paperwork and lonely nights and the awkwardness of redefining your social circles. But there is also something else waiting in that fog. The return. The return of your laughter. The return of a nervous system that can finally rest. The return of a home that feels like a sanctuary rather than a prison. The fear of divorce is ultimately the fear of the new self. It is terrifying to meet the version of you that doesn't have to manage someone else's moods. It is intimidating to realize you have the power to build a life from scratch. But remember this, you have survived the frozen life for years. You have already proven you were strong enough to endure the cold. Now you only need to be brave enough to walk toward the warmth. Healing doesn't begin when the papers are signed. It begins the moment you stop asking for permission to be happy. It begins when you look at the maybe and choose the now. You are not a failure for ending a chapter. You are a visionary for starting the next one. The wall is high and the path is steep, but on the other side is the only person you have truly missed all these years, yourself.